1944, Bastogne, Belgium, Christmas Eve. Snow drifted through the holes in broken rafters, melted on the metal bed frames, and froze again on the floor. The only light came from a flickering lantern balanced on an ammunition crate. Wind blew the smell of gunpowder through the stone basement that served as a hospital. Groans echoed off damp walls where 2 American nurses worked without heat, without morphine, without hope of help. Outside, the German artillery ring closed tighter every hour. Shells gnashed against the town like teeth. Inside, men were dying not from bombs or bullets, but from fever, infected wounds crawling toward the heart. On a shelf behind a canvas tarp lay a wooden crate stamped medical, restricted. Inside, glass vials glimmered faintly in the lantern glow. New medicine, penicillin, reserved for officers and tank crews locked away under strict orders. The nurse stared at it for a long time, her breath fogging in the cold. Then she reached for the crate, hand shaking more from decision than from chill. The war outside roared, but what she was about to do was quieter. It was defiance whispered in the language of mercy. To understand how that single act preserved 200 lives under siege, we must first return to the frozen circle of battle that was Bastogne. December 1944. Europe had been at war for more than 5 years, and for the weary Allied soldiers pressing through the Ardennes, the end had seemed close. Paris was free, the German front collapsing, and rumors said they would be home by Christmas. Then on December 16th, Hitler launched his last gamble, an all-out surprise, offensive through the snow-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. It came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack split Allied lines and turned quiet winter villages into fortresses overnight. Columns of German tanks rumbled out of the mist, followed by infantry camouflaged in white smocks. Roads vanished in snow. Artillery shattered bridges before retreating convoys could cross them. Amid this chaos lay one small Belgian town, Bastogne, an ordinary crossroads that became the center of the storm. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed in by truck, arrived barely in time. They brought grit and rifles, but little else. Snow fell harder each day. Temperatures dropped below freezing and supply convoys were cut off. Within 2 days, Bastogne was surrounded on all sides. The men were trapped, 8,000 against almost 4 times that number, and they were running out of everything. For the wounded, the siege was worse than the battle. Artillery barrages turned church cellars and school halls into field hospitals. Basements filled with wounded paratroopers, frostbitten infantrymen, and local civilians pulled from the rubble. Electricity was gone. Stretchers became tables, blankets torn in two. Morphine was rationed to drops per patient. Blood plasma froze solid before it reached the needle. In this frozen chaos stood the nurses and medics of the 64th Field Hospital. Most were women in their 20s, barely older than the men they treated. Some had landed in Normandy months before. Others had arrived only days earlier, drafted into Bastogne by a reckless stroke of logistics. Among them was a Belgian Congolese volunteer, Augusta Chiwy, summoned from her nursing post in Louvain, and a local nurse, Renee Lemaire, known to soldiers simply as the Angel of Bastogne. Both worked beside the American medical staff under the supervision of Colonel Dr. John T. Pryor, Chief Surgeon of the 10th Armored Division. Day and night, they cleaned wounds with melted snow and sawdust-filtered water. When antiseptic was gone, they used liquor confiscated from an abandoned cafe. One soldier later wrote in a letter home, "We could smell death everywhere except where the nurses walked. Somehow near them, there was only work." Supplies dropped by C-47 aircraft never reached the town. Gusts of wind scattered the parachuted bundles into German lines. The winter sky stayed low and gray, grounding Allied fighters and medevac planes. Food grew as scarce as bandages. Soldiers boiled snow for soup and called it Belgian hash. By December 22nd, the encirclement was complete. The German 7th Army broadcast a demand for surrender. General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," echoed defiance, but inside the town's makeshift hospitals, the real battle was against infection. Open wounds turned black at the edges. Streptococcus, tetanus, and gangrene spread through entire wards. The only true weapon against such enemy was penicillin, still rationed as a luxury for tank crews and the highest-risk surgical units. A crate of the antibiotic, landed in France just weeks before, sat in Bastogne under medical quartermaster control, locked, inventoried, forbidden to use without authorization. For most nurses, that barrier was inviolate. But for one woman staring at the blood-slick floors of her crowded basement, rules were a distant echo. She cared little whose signature blocked the cure. Between the distant boom of artillery and the rasping breaths of the dying, she weighed her decision nightly. Rumor spread that some morphine had come by jeep before the encirclement shut tight. Perhaps there was still hope. But by Christmas Eve, the choice would no longer be theoretical. Men were dying faster than she could count. Before that moment of defiance would come, Bastogne itself had to descend fully into siege, the garrison fighting in blizzards, the civilians starving under bombardment, the medics improvising miracles beneath frozen stone. By Christmas week, Bastogne had the anatomy of a coffin. The forests that fenced it on every side funneled artillery blasts straight into the town's heart. Shells struck in chains, every noon, every night, grinding roofs into splinters and filling the air with powdered brick and snow. The temperature sank to almost 20 degrees below freezing. Smoke was the only warmth left. The 101st Airborne dug foxholes into frozen farmland and waited for relief that might not come. Rations dwindled from canned meat to hard biscuits. Some men ate snow to trick their stomachs. Frostbite took fingers. Fear took sleep. Within the perimeter, medics scavenged everything. Parachute silk for bandages, water barrels for stretchers. Doctors worked shoulder to shoulder in dark basements, where lanterns hung from bent nails. Colonel Dr. John Pryor's command post became the core of the field hospital network. So, collection of cellars joined by tunnel passages. His team treated hundreds each day under blackout conditions. The thud of shells above mixed with the steady rhythm of bone saws. They sterilized scalpels in tin cups of boiling snow. Operations never stopped. Augusta Chiwy moved between wards barefoot when her boots froze solid. She spoke English, French, and Flemish, bridging desperate wounded and foreign medics. The Americans were astonished at her calm. She scarcely blinked when patients screamed awake from chloroform shortages. She kept one hand on their shoulder and the other on the lantern. Within days, she and Renee Lemaire had become legends among the soldiers waylaid below ground. Two women who defied both fear and frostbite simply by staying. But the conditions that made them saints also made them rebels waiting to happen. The forbidden serum had arrived weeks earlier in a small convoy of supply trucks, before the encirclement cut the road from Neufchâteau. It was part of a limited shipment of penicillin, then one of the rarest substances on Earth. For the Allies, every vial was strategic. It could prevent infection in a general as easily as a private, yet the planning bureaucracy rationed it by rank and priority. Guidelines dictated that the 101st's frontline aid stations for tankers and airborne officers receive first call. Field hospitals behind the perimeter, especially those with civilians, were considered expendable. Pryor's medical officers recited the policy with bitterness, but obeyed. In sealed crates lay what could have stopped the tide of infection soaking through the basements of Bastogne. Each ampule represented not only a life but also a crime if taken without paperwork. Command knew theft could mean court-martial when the war was done. Moral command confronted different arithmetic. Living men turning septic before dawn. Meanwhile, German loudspeakers blared propaganda toward Allied lines. Americans, you are surrounded. No help will come. The same broadcast drifted into cellars where the wounded trembled. Between explosions, nurses whispered psalms. Faith froze alongside bone. Christmas approached as silence between bombardments. A few soldiers carved crosses from broken rifle stocks. Others sang carols between coughs. The nurses did what they could, wrapping shivering bodies in curtains stripped from abandoned houses, scraping candle wax into new wicks. When the town's cathedral collapsed after a direct hit, its crypt became another ward. There was no room left for the dead. Bodies were stacked in doorways awaiting burial after the thaw. In this gravity of despair, the question of the serum became an inevitability. Chiwy and Lemaire had watched too many soldiers fade while the unopened crate collected frost in Pryor's storeroom. A fragment of rumor suggested that authorized shipments were already spoiled from cold. The doctors debated paperwork. The nurses counted heartbeats. On December 24th, the argument ended with artillery. A train of shells shattered the upper floors of the convent sheltering one of the wards. Flames poured downward through the stairwell. Lemaire, carrying patients on her shoulders, refused to flee until the final man was out. Minutes later, the roof collapsed. Her body was found the next morning beside her lantern. News of her death spread through the cellars like current through wire, grief igniting fury and resolve. That night, the surviving nurse lifted the crate's lid. 4 vials rolled against each other like dice in candlelight. Her face was streaked with soot, her breath visible in the frigid air. Somewhere above, Bastogne burned. Somewhere below, life stirred in her trembling hands. The siege had reached its moment of decision, and the act that followed would turn forbidden medicine into a miracle, woven through the final hours before relief arrived. In theory, a field hospital is a sanctuary. In Bastogne, it was just another front line folded underground. The basement smelled of whetstone and blood, candles guttered against draft seeping through shelled alleys. Men lay so tightly packed that litters brushed knees as orderlies stepped between them. The wounded spoke in whispers that turned to fevered monologues, tale after tale dissolving into delirium. For the nurses, humanity became mechanical repetition. Dress, clamp, cut, wrap. They measured success by silence. A patient too weak to scream was a wound finished. In these depths time blurred. Nurses moved by instinct, part caretaker, part soldier. When bombs thudded above, they paused only to let the ceiling dust settle before resuming stitches. Augusta Chiwy worked 20-hour shifts, her uniform crusted with dried plasma. With so few instruments left, she sterilized needles and cooking pots borrowed from civilians. Her small act of defiance was continuity, to remind men that order still existed while the world above disintegrated. Her Belgian accent became a lullaby, foreign sounds offering strange comfort to dying Americans who believed they would never see home again. When Renee Lemaire's ward burned, survivors remembered her carrying the bandaged across a carpet of flame. The grief that followed turned survival itself into obligation. The remaining staff swore not to let another patient die if treatment still existed anywhere in Bastogne. That oath set the stage for the forbidden serum's use. Inside the hospital, there were no uniforms anymore. Everyone covered in equal shades of soot. The wounded were the same color, one medic recalled later. Gray. Yet among those grays flickered moments of light. A nurse adjusting a helmet cushion under a soldier's head. Another slicing bread thin enough to share among 6. Compassion became an operating system, and defying regulation its natural extension. When Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, even he couldn't imagine the desperation that would follow its wartime scarcity. By 1944, mass production had begun in America, but distribution remained limited to high-value military units. Every 5-gram vial represented an industrial miracle shipped across the Atlantic, in cold containers guarded as strategic cargo. For the ordinary medic, penicillin was legend, rumored to reverse infections once considered certain death. Each transparent ampule carried new arithmetic. One dose might clear sepsis in hours, while a lack of it condemned a man to gangrene and amputation. Officially, Army regulations classified it as controlled substance, supply priority A, meaning command property. In Bastogne's tunnels, its presence was both hope and torture. The crate had arrived stamped with red warnings: for immediate field distribution, do not divert. Alongside it lay documentation in triplicate: logistics codes, temperature restrictions, usage tally sheets, a bureaucracy still functioning in a town already declared cut off. The nurses understood its potential instinctively. In civilian hospitals before the war, they'd seen penicillin's miracles on civilians lucky enough to receive the rare trial doses. They also knew the risk. Missed dosage could cause fatal reactions. Infection strain could resist incomplete courses. Treatment required careful dilution, refrigeration, regular injection cycles. Luxuries Bastogne could not provide, and yet to do nothing meant certain death for dozens daily. Pressure sores turned black, wounds puffed green with pus. Infection outpaced surgery. The human body's bacterial enemy was winning more territory inside these basements than German troops gained outside. When the nurse broke open the crate, she faced a chemically simple but morally explosive choice. Reconstituting powdered penicillin demanded sterile water and measured saline. She used boiled snow. Syringes were stainless, bent from overuse. She straightened them over a candle flame. Dosage notes scrawled on the back of a prayer leaflet replaced official log sheets. Each injection was calculated guesswork by flickering light. The immediate effects astonished everyone. Within hours of the first doses, fevers ebbed, heart rates steadied. Soldiers who'd been unconscious lifted their heads. In that moment, medicine crossed into miracle territory. News rippled quietly through the wards. The serum is working. Hope re-entered conversation for the first time in weeks. But hope came with fear. If discovered, the act would be deemed theft, or worse, negligence, risking contamination of the precious supply. The risk balanced on equal sides of the same scale, obedience or survival. That balance between hierarchy's obedience and a healer's instinct was not unique to Bastogne. Across the front, medics improvised within chaos. But here, the stakes compressed into one small basement where compassion would soon collide with catastrophe. War often begins with doctrine and ends with decisions made by human breath. In Bastogne, the distance between saving a life and disobeying an order was measured in milliliters of clear liquid. The nurse who drew those first doses knew the regulations by heart. Every vial required a surgeon's authorization and written record for regional command. But the men around her weren't regulations. They were bodies shaking from fever, skin bluish under sweat, life counting down by pulse beats. The moral argument was simple in theory and unbearable in practice. If she obeyed command, 200 soldiers would likely die before morning. If she defied it, she preserved life through insubordination. Doctors argued across the corridor, some insisting on discipline to keep order, others ready to protect ignorance by calling her improvisation experimental. Afterward, none of them pretended certainty. The war forced morality to bend toward necessity. Later testimonies described her act with phrases like unauthorized compassion and illegal salvation. Both were true. That contradiction hung over every Allied medic in field hospitals from Italy to the Ardennes. Where bureaucracy met blood, only conscience could sign the release form. Outside Bastogne's rubble, the German 7th Army was freezing too. Their soldiers advanced through snow in cloth boots, supply lines stretched thin, fuel nearly exhausted. From the ridges encircling the town, they watched the glow of artillery reflect off columns of smoke. Inside Allied lines, they imagined chaos but never guessed at the order maintained by 2 women and a few dozen surgeons under candlelight. For the German medics, conditions differed little. Too few bandages, not enough anesthetic, the same bacteria consuming the same wounds. In field hospitals behind the Bulge, their doctors resorted to sulfa powder and prayer. Letters captured later revealed how demoralized even successful attackers had become. We still win battles but cannot save the wounded. Command propaganda insisted that Bastogne's defenders were doomed. Radio broadcasts claimed the Americans inside would freeze and starve within 2 days. Yet as hours passed with no surrender, frustration curdled into dread. Artillery commanders increased shelling of suspected hospital zones, believing them ammunition depots. On Christmas Eve, their bombs hit the wrong target, the convent infirmary, and killed the very nurse they might have admired had the lines been reversed. Decades later, a surviving German officer admitted that after the war he toured Bastogne's restored hospital basement. It smelled of disinfectant and candles, he said quietly. It was the same smell we had, only the uniforms were different. For half a century, official histories of the Battle of the Bulge scarcely mentioned the nurses who stayed. Their records were buried in after-action reports coded as civilian assistants. Augusta Chiwy, a black woman in Allied uniform, returned to obscurity despite eyewitnesses calling her the Belgian Florence Nightingale. She worked as a doctor's assistant after the war, unrecognized until 2011 when Belgium knighted her for valor. The citation listed her contribution simply: she saved lives under impossible fire. The anonymity had reasons both bureaucratic and social. Battlefield medicine was rarely celebrated as heroism. It lacked spectacle. The image of courage favored bullets over bandages. Race and gender deepened the neglect. Stories told by men about men didn't know where to place a Congolese Belgian nurse in American khaki, bending over white soldiers. Yet her act transformed not only medicine but memory. By breaking regulations, she also broke silence around who could be remembered as a hero. Her defiance revealed a truth that outlasted hierarchy. Humanity has no uniform color. In later years, veterans who owed her their lives spoke softly of the nurse who gave us back warmth. Survivors recounted how she hummed hymns while injecting the reconstituted penicillin, how she refused to leave even when medevac finally opened, how she never asked for recognition beyond that basement's peace when the guns went quiet. History recovered her name only when surviving paratroopers sought her out. Their reunion, white-haired men embracing the nurse who had once defied orders for them, proved a kind of belated justice. By then, the term forbidden serum had entered popular retellings, a condensed symbol of the moral frontier crossed in a freezing town. Those quiet hands in Bastogne became shorthand for an entire generation of healers who fought their war without weapons. Her decision wouldn't end the siege, but it changed its meaning. The next act belonged to Weather Artillery and Patton's tanks grinding north, but the dawn that followed her defiance had already begun to thaw the frozen town from within. December 24th, 1944, Christmas arrived in Bastogne as noise and fire. The Luftwaffe's night raid began without warning, a drooping hum over the plateau, then sudden whines as bombs fell through fog. Every building that still had a roof lost it within minutes. Snow turned black with soot. Outside the convent cellar hospital, nurses shielded their heads with blankets as the sky dissolved. Inside, the jarred lantern toppled, throwing smoke instead of light. A candle on a crate became their only beacon. Men who could stand crawled deeper into the basement while shrapnel pierced the upper rooms like rain. The blast that killed Renee Lemaire hurled debris down the corridor. The nurses screamed her name and carried what bodies they could through the smoke. When the fire subsided, half the ward was gone. Amid the ashes, Augusta Chiwy stood shaking yet alive. She could see the outline of the crate through the haze, the red stenciled letters now faded by heat. Something inside her resolved with stunning calm. If there was ever a moment when orders no longer mattered, it was this one. She pulled the lid up, breaking the wax stamp with a table knife. 4 vials, small as her thumb, rolled into her palm. Each seemed to hold more light than the room itself. The surgeon stared, torn between awe and terror. To be caught using the restricted antibiotic without authorization meant court-martial, maybe prison. But their commander was gone, and the alternative lay dying around them. She prepared the solution from melted snow, the only sterile water left. Using a scalpel handle as pestle, she ground the crystallized powder until it dissolved. One of the young medics sterilized a syringe in candle flame. They wrote no records. There was no paper that hadn't already burned. The first injection went to a paratrooper with gas gangrene creeping up his thigh. His pulse thinned beneath her fingers. Within hours, his fever began to break. Another soldier, delirious from infection, muttered half-conscious thanks. The transformation spread quiet disbelief. Wounds stopped oozing, breathing steadied, skin tones shifted back toward life. Even the doctors could hardly believe what they saw in that flickering candlelight. Throughout the night, she moved from cot to cot, dividing the serum into the smallest fractions possible, reusing syringes until her fingers blurred. No one slept. They measured time not by hours but by the number of heartbeats that returned from silence. Above them, the battle thundered on. German shells rained over the northern sector, where the 327th Glider Infantry struggled to hold their line. Snow mixed with flame, staining the clouds orange. In the hospitals below, the explosions felt like new heartbeats answering their own. By dawn, the crates were empty. 30 men who should have died still breathed. Their muttered voices sounded like hymn fragments, grief mingling with relief. For the first time in weeks, the word lucky passed from mouth to mouth. That morning, a fragment of blue opened in the sky. The first clear weather in 10 days. Through that slit of light came the distant growl of engines. Soldiers looked up from trenches in disbelief. American C-47s flying overhead. One by one, parachutes blossomed behind them, bright silk against snow. Food, bandages, ammunition, and proper ampules of penicillin tumbled down like miracles given shape. Inside the infirmary, those too weak to stand pressed faces against the cellar windows, watching parachutes drift. Some wept. Others simply whispered finally. And for Chiwy, it felt as if the air itself approved her defiance. The forbidden doses had carried her patients across the final longest night. Now, with rescue in sight, Bastogne's heartbeat returned. The storm outside receded slowly. replaced by the dull rhythm of distant tank guns. General Patton's Third Army was nearing the perimeter, plowing through snowdrifts under orders to reach the town at all costs. Every mile he closed narrowed the siege's throat. But before the armored columns broke through, the work below continued as methodically as before. The living still required tending, the dead still needed covering. The nurses had become creatures of endurance, beings of rhythm and ritual. Each pulse under their fingers sounded louder now in answer to every bombardment. When evening fell again, the candles burned lower, but the cellar air no longer smelled of decay. It smelled of medicine. Somewhere above, the bells of a wrecked church chimed in the wind, a broken note that still resembled music. Before Christmas was done, the Americans would break through the German ring. Yet even as the tanks approached, the miracle of Bastogne had already unfolded below ground, one injection at a time. The revelation that followed would ripple through the armies and decades beyond. December 26, 1944. At 16:45 hours, observers on Bastogne's western ridge caught the first sound of deliverance, a low rumble that didn't belong to artillery. It built second after second until the air trembled. Men in trenches rose half afraid it was illusion, but from the gray horizon burst a column of steel moving through drifting snow. Patton's tanks of the 4th Armored Division, treads grinding ice into victory. When the lead Sherman broke through the German line at Assenois and reached the Bastogne road, the defenders knew they were no longer alone. After 7 days under siege, the circle opened. American troops cheered, hoarse and disbelieving. Snow mixed with exhaust. Tears blended with powder smoke. It was the Army's loudest silence. The sound of breathing again. Below them, the nurses had no time to celebrate. Word of relief came as another trickle of the wounded poured into the basements. The roar of engines outside marked salvation for the living and burial drums for those who hadn't survived the night. Chiwy remained at her table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, continuing the cycle of injections using what new penicillin had been dropped from the sky. Her rebellion had become protocol. Dr. Pryor entered the cellar briefly, face blackened with soot and exhaustion. He saluted softly, not in irony but gratitude. Together they moved through rows of men, recording vitals and whispering encouragement. The torches and makeshift lamps seemed brighter, as though the oxygen of hope itself now fed their flames. Upstairs, Patton's messengers reached headquarters, and news of survival became legend almost instantly. War correspondents arriving days later wrote of angels working through gunfire. Among the men they interviewed were those who'd received the nurses' illegal doses. One paratrooper told them, "She didn't ask permission, and that's why I'm still here." Another said simply, "She gave us Christmas when everything else had frozen." While tanks chased the retreating Germans into the woods, Patton's supply trucks poured through Bastogne's shattered streets. They delivered medicine, blood plasma, coffee, and bandages. Doctors reopened the burning crate from the previous week to recatalog inventory, only to discover the forbidden serum mostly gone, but its results impossible to dispute. The survival rates in the Enclave's hospitals were twice what command had predicted for such isolation. News spread through the 101st Airborne like gospel. Soldiers whispered that one nurse had saved the town with black market magic. It wasn't magic, simply courage intertwined with science, a gamble now vindicated by relief and paperwork that could finally catch up with conscience. No charges were filed, no reprimands issued. The military needed miracles more than scapegoats. In the days that followed, Chiwy and the surviving medics buried Renee Lemaire in a shell crater that served as temporary cemetery behind the convent ruins. The funeral was brief. Snow fell in soft, heavy sheets blanketing the churned ground. Her name was carved into a ration crate board. When the squad finished covering her grave, Chiwy placed a vial cap on top, the last fragment of the serum they'd shared, a small, gleaming token of rebellion turned grace. For Bastogne's defenders, the siege had transfigured reality. The battle's outcome could be counted in territory regained, but its meaning existed in smaller units. A heartbeat found after silence, a wound closed against infection, a single survivor writing home. The forbidden serum had not won the war, yet those who witnessed it claimed it won something deeper. Faith that compassion needed no permission slip. As January began, General Eisenhower toured the still smoking streets. Veterans gathered round him in muddy greatcoats, some leaning on crutches, others saluting with bandaged hands. In official photographs, the general smiles faintly, while snowflakes stipple his cap brim. What the camera missed was the entrance to the cellar beneath his boots, where one exhausted nurse still tended to her patients, unaware she had become a legend. Across the lines, German field headquarters compiled reports of their defeat. Weather analyses, fuel shortages, ammunition deficits. A post-mortem of an offensive doomed by logistics. The medical records inside those offices listed thousands of casualties left behind. Among them were notes describing enemy nurses tending German prisoners with equal care. War had laws. Mercy had none. By early January, Bastogne's hospitals were reorganized under the reconnected Allied Medical Corps. Each surviving staff member received commendation letters. Chiwy's bore a single sentence from her commanding officer, for conduct far exceeding duty and faith. It was the closest military language could come to describing what she had done. Outside, the Ardennes thawed. The snow that had preserved corpses now released them to burial teams. Through those melting drifts echoed the sound of bells, irregular, broken, but unmistakably alive. Bastogne breathed again. Years later, veterans returning on pilgrimage would stand before the rebuilt convent and remember the smell of disinfectant and candle wax, the hum of whispers translating pain into language. They would tell their children about the forbidden medicine that saved 200 men in a church basement, and about the nurse who chose disobedience over despair. The winter siege had ended in victory, but the battle that mattered most had already been fought in that underground room, fought not for ground, but for the meaning of duty itself. From that decision flowed a quiet revolution that would echo through post-war medicine and memory alike. When the guns finally ceased around Bastogne, silence sounded foreign. The snow, soaked with months of ash and blood, began to thaw in zebra-striped patches along the ruined streets. The first trucks of Patton's Third Army rolled through what had been the front line, engines spluttering, treads carving the meltwater into rivers. Relief had come, but relief was not peace. It was exhaustion given space to breathe. The hospitals moved above ground once the shelling stopped. Sun cut through cracks in the convent roof and pooled light over beds lined in the nave. News photographers arrived and lined up their cameras expecting triumph. Instead, they found faces pale and distant, nurses and surgeons too tired to pose beside the men they'd saved. Paperwork replaced adrenaline. The wounded were logged, bloodied bandages counted, surviving vials tallied. In the official ledger, 23 doses of penicillin were unaccounted for. Under ordinary regulations, such a discrepancy demanded an investigation. But the inspector sent to Bastogne saw the wards personally, 200 men recovering who should have been names on casualty lists. His report closed with one sentence: loss justified by results. No further inquiry required. Throughout January 1945, wounded soldiers were airlifted south to France. Many carried infections still healing. The Bastogne cases, doctors called them. Mysteries of rapid recovery under impossible conditions. None of the men being examined understood their shared secret, an unauthorized experiment performed by candlelight in an underground ward. Years later, comparing medical notes, historians traced the link back to the forbidden serum. For the remaining medics, the exhalation of survival quickly turned to mourning. They buried their dead again, properly this time, laying simple wooden crosses in the churchyard once mined for shells. Among them rested Renee Lemaire, her grave tended by the nurse who had outlived her. Every Sunday that winter, Chiwy placed a lantern on the mound before beginning another shift for the flood of new casualties pushing through the front. The light was small but visible from the road, a beacon many soldiers mistook for the church's returning heart. Outside the city, reporters walked the perimeter and wrote headlines calling Bastogne the hinge of victory, but few asked about the hospitals. In public imagination, courage had a male face and a rifle. Mercy was background noise. Penicillin itself would soon spread across every Allied theater, produced by the ton, its scarcity forgotten. The act that had broken the rulebook quietly melted into routine. Yet within the Army's medical corps, whispers lingered. Officers used Bastogne as a case study in adaptive authority, a bureaucrat's euphemism for moral gamble. Lectures given to post-war medics posed its unsung question: when the manual fails, who writes it anew? The men who owed their lives never needed theory. Returning home, They remembered a woman's steady hands and the smell of disinfectant mixed with smoke. Some sent letters to Brussels asking after her. Most never learned her name until decades later. To them, she was simply the nurse who refused to give up on Christmas Eve. In March, when Allied forces began their final drive into Germany, Bastogne stood transformed from symbol of desperation to monument of endurance. Visitors found shell craters filled with melted snow, basements cleared of debris save for one corner, still faintly marked by candle burn on stone. Locals called it the Room of Miracles. Those who worked there avoided the word miracle. They preferred chance as courage or even necessity. For them, heroism felt too neat. They had seen what it looked like in practice, a shaking hand drawing forbidden fluid into a cracked syringe while the world collapsed above. The siege was over, but the consequences of that single act were just beginning. The legacy of mercy-defying command would ripple through post-war medicine, rewiring both ethics and memory, the story of how Bastogne's salvation traveled far beyond its frozen walls. In the months after Bastogne's relief, the story folded quietly into the margins of official reports. Military archives measured the victory in square miles and prisoners captured. No ledger had a column for the anonymous hands that held the line under candlelight. Yet among those who had witnessed the seller's defiance, the memory endured like a half-healed scar. Augusta Chiwy returned to Louvain in early 1945, demobilized without ceremony. She carried no medals, only the echo of a choir of coughing men who had once sworn she was heaven sent. The new hospitals of Brussels overflowed with refugees from both sides, British, German, and Belgian alike. She treated them all with the same patience she had shown at Bastogne. It was her personal armistice. Penicillin, once rationed like treasure, flooded the post-war world within months. Factories in the United States and Britain produced tons each week. By the time peace was signed, it was hailed as the miracle drug of the century. Journalists celebrated laboratories, not the basements where its worth had first been proven beneath falling shells. The forbidden serum became textbook fact, detached from the moral dare that had birthed it. Decades slid by. Veterans aged, medals tarnished, and the frozen hospitals of Bastogne crumbled into memorials. Visitors who came to see the battlefield walked over ground once soaked in meltwater and disinfectant, unaware of the silent revolution that had begun below their feet. Yet for those whose lives had been measured in hours that winter, the nurse remained a living prayer whispered by name or memory. In 2011, 66 years after the siege, Belgium finally honored Augusta Chiwy. The ceremony was small, a handful of officials, cameras, and gray-haired men whose bodies still bore the marks of frostbite and shrapnel. When Knights of the Order pinned the medal to her coat, she smiled faintly and said, "I only did my duty." It was the same phrase soldiers had used to justify killing. She used it to describe saving. Across the Atlantic, historians revisited the American medical records. They confirmed the impossible. 200 patients listed as survivors despite infection rates that should have been fatal. Military regulations had already changed by then. Autonomy for field medics expanded, emergency authority rewritten under the lessons of Bastogne. What was once disobedience had become doctrine. For the families of Renee Lemaire and Augusta Chiwy, remembrance carried both pride and silence. In Bastogne's rebuilt chapel, a brass plaque stands by the altar, dedicated to those who served the wounded during the siege, December 1944. No ranks, no names. Only the word served. In that simplicity lies the essence of their contribution: service beyond order, mercy beyond instruction. Today, museum visitors see photographs of snow-choked streets, tanks fossilized in ice, soldiers wrapped in wool. Few notice the image of a nurse in a white cap bending over a patient, candlelight outlining her profile. The caption identifies her only as medical personnel. Yet those who know the story can almost smell the antiseptic, hear the creak of floorboards as artillery crashed above, feel the decision crystallizing between her fingers. In letters preserved by survivors, her work became metaphor. One soldier wrote, "The angels didn't come down. They came up from the basements." Another said, "I was saved by a rule broken for the right reason." In their understated words lives the entire moral aftermath of Bastogne. By the late 1990s, historians would call the nurses of Bastogne the invisible front. Their quiet triumph stood opposite the war's thunder. a proof that compassion endured even when reason collapsed. It was not the end of battle that made Bastogne sacred, but the persistence of care that refused to die. And somewhere beneath the restored convent, tourists still find a small recess of stone stained darker than the surrounding walls. Guides call it residual soot. Locals call it the finger mark of history. It is all that remains of the firelight where forbidden vials once gleamed. From that dim cellar came more than 200 recoveries and one enduring revelation. That defiance in the name of mercy changes more than battles. It alters the threshold of what humanity demands from itself. In the chronicles of war, the line between heroism and disobedience is drawn by the victors. Yet in Bastogne it was drawn by a nurse holding a syringe. Her decision was neither rebellion nor faith in science alone. It was the quiet certainty that compassion outranks command. History often remembers the generals who break sieges, but seldom the healers who break rules. What happened beneath the frozen ruins of that Belgian town was more than improvisation. It was the moment humanity reasserted itself in a world devoted to orders. When Augusta Chiwy lifted that vial of penicillin, she rewrote the moral code of the battlefield. She proved that victory need not come from fire, but from endurance. The endurance to keep another heart beating when every directive said stop. Penicillin would go on to save millions. Her handful of doses proved what laboratories could only promise. The miracle was not chemical, it was moral. It taught armies that mercy could be logistical, that saving lives required courage equal to taking them. Today, Bastogne stands peaceful, its rebuilt streets echoing the steps of visitors who know the battle only through maps and monuments. Few realize that beneath their feet once stood a cellar that defied despair. In the coldest winter of war, when steel replaced reason and orders crushed instinct, one nurse reminded the world that the smallest act of care could thaw centuries of cruelty. The snow melted. The war ended, but her choice endures, as lesson, as question, as echo. Who decides when doing right outweighs doing as told? In Bastogne, the answer was written in candlelight, across 200 pulses that refused to fade. And perhaps that is the true victory of 1944. That among all the noise of artillery and history's endless catalog of destruction, the softest sound, the hiss of a forbidden syringe, still speaks of what it means to be human. Like the documentary? Hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WWII stories every day.